to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Ketevan Chincharadze. She's a foreign policy analyst and researcher, content creator at FYGO. She is based in Washington, D.C., and she'll be discussing with us the current situation in Georgia, the post-election fallout, the various geopolitical challenges, what that means for South Caucasus, what it means for the U.S. interests in the region, and for many other players. Ketevan, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start a little bit with a little bit of a discussion about yourself, your professional background, and what you're doing.
Well, thank you, Irina, for this opportunity to do a deep dive into Georgia's political climate as we experience this deep crisis in the country amidst the mass demonstrations that we face in Tbilisi, continuing for over 2 weeks by now. I am Ketevan Chincharadze, born and raised in Tbilisi, Georgia, as you've mentioned. I left the country to receive the international education when I was 17, not even 18. And I go back to my country back and forth for work, to visit. So I keep a very close touch. I'm currently based in the United States, where I received a master's degree in international security from the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And I am a foreign policy analyst and researcher. I publish frequently on the developments in Eastern Europe, particularly in Georgia and Ukraine, and as they relate to great power competition between US, Russia, and China. So thank you again, and I am looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much. That is indeed a great background and a great look. And let's start with a bit of an overview about Russia's involvement in Georgia and its strategic interest there. Let's start with looking back at 2008 and what happened there and why no one intervened, given the fact that at the time the Bush administration placed such a high priority on democracy, went to bat to Iraq for democracy, supported elections in Gaza, and yet, when there was a clear violation of international law, did not really come down hard or get involved in any way.
Well, Russia's involvement in Georgia is a very complex issue, right? We have been rivals and even enemies for centuries. Our problem didn't start in 2008. We were invaded during the Imperial Russia times. Soviet Union was also another invasion. And right now we see the ongoing struggle from Moscow to kind of regain its power over Tbilisi. We've always looked to break away from Russian influence. It is our northern neighbor, a much more powerful one. However, at times we've succeeded, at times we have not. And Georgia, after 1991, this is the dissolution of the Soviet Union, has looked to the West to break away from Russian influence and build a democracy that is stable, prosperous, where human rights are defended, and where Russia has limited influence. Well, in 2008, why Russia intervened in Georgia, there are a lot of different theories about this. I think the best characterization of the events of 2008 is by Ronald Asmus, who wrote a book about Little War that shook the world. And whoever has access to this book, I highly recommend that everybody reads it. This is a diplomatic account told from the first person perspective, based on highly reliable sources, what actually happened and transpired during the Bucharest summit. This is the summit when Georgia and Ukraine famously got their promises that they were going to join NATO one day, but they did not. Well, a lot of people ascribe the invasion of Georgia to its NATO membership aspirations, just like in case of Ukraine. However, this book and a lot of other scholars, including me, think that NATO really had a very limited stake in it. I think NATO did provoke Russia. There's no question about it, because it has been a controversial issue since its establishment, since 1991, when NATO decided to expand. But was it significant enough to provoke an entire war in Georgia? I don't think so. There's a lot of evidence that shows that this war was actually getting prepared from 2007. And if we recall Putin's 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he talks about Eurasianism and Russia's unique identity to be this bridge between Europe and Asia, where he tacitly wants to rebuild Russia's influence in former Soviet Union, you will see that this war was an action taken by Moscow to exercise control over Georgia, to not let it democratize, and show the lesson to other former Soviet Union countries like Ukraine what is going to happen if you try to break away from Russian influence. I have also spoken about this with Secretary Condoleezza Rice. I've had the pleasure of meeting with her. And she shared, not only with me, but also in multiple interviews, that back then Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president, really hated the guts of President Saakashvili, who was so pro-Western that Georgia was on a fast-paced track towards European and NATO integration. And Putin really wanted to oust Saakashvili from the country and install a puppet government. And I remember Secretary Rice saying that she stood up against Vladimir Putin, saying that the two countries would not be negotiating about the removal of president of Georgia, who was democratically elected. So this was a semblance of a lot of different factors: Russian provocation, Russian interests to not let Georgia westernize, as well as NATO expansion. There's a lot of criticism right now addressed to Western leaders who promised Georgia and Ukraine NATO membership. But unfortunately, if they did not give any guarantees, any tangible means, how would they do that? So these were empty words that were not followed by actions. And I think this was a big strategic mistake that we can look at in the hindsight.
So can it be said then that the fact that there was no clear path for membership gave an opening to invade before they did become members, and then therefore would be protected by Article 5?
Right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Georgia is a small country, right? Mm-hmm. If you want to start warning the West what is yet to come, and we saw what it looks like in 2022 by Ukraine's full-scale invasion, you're going to start small. And I think Georgia was a logical first step to showcase what Russia is capable of. And unfortunately, the West did not see back then that it was a buildup, that Russia was not going to stop there and there would be more to come. West was very slow to recognize this. And actually, my new publication just came out. I think it will already be out by this time this YouTube video is up and running. I have analyzed the enduring impact of the 2008 Russo-Georgian War at War Room, which is an online publication of the U.S. Army War College. And I would encourage audience to go and take a look at it to see what impact this war has had since 2008 and how does it continue to define and inform us what Russia, Moscow, and Putin's regime are about.
You know, I really hate to use overwrought comparisons to Hitler and Nazis, which are overused in every conceivable context, but nevertheless, the appeasement and gradual expansionism of dictatorships, whether through conventional means or through proxies, as the cases with Iran in the Middle East, to use a less tired analogy, should have given some clue to the international community that once a country or an actor ceases to follow international law and respect boundaries, there's no real reason why they shouldn't do so somewhere else. So how do you explain this failure to recognize the pretty obvious?
Well, it is obvious if you're looking from the outside, right? When you take a step back, things start to look differently. It is not so easy to recognize what's happening around you when you're in it. And we've seen over and over again. And also, Putin is a smart man. He might be an evil one, but he's definitely very smart, very strategic. He knows what he is doing. Putin has a very favorite philosopher, Ilin, who has written a lot about fascism and whose philosophy has been cornerstone for his propaganda. And I also talk about these issues on my YouTube channel for Georgian audiences because Russian propaganda is really prevalent. So Putin has really tried to adopt strategic ideological frameworks to justify what he's doing. And he's been very, very successful doing that, using religion, Eastern Orthodoxy, as something that really clarifies what Russian kindness is about, what Russian society is about, using children to justify some anti-governmental laws in their name, trying to defend children, trying to defend family values while he is repressing the Russian society. And he has created the society in which people know their own place. They don't they don't try to climb the social ladder. There's no such thing. You shut up and you do your own thing. This is a procedural democracy. You go out to vote. You have this fake democracy, illiberal democracy, if you will. You know who's the winner is, and nobody asks questions anymore. And another great thing that Putin did is in 2010s, after 2012 to be precise, when he won another term, he started accusing the West, the United States, NATO, Europe, and everything bad that was happening in Russia. When there were mass demonstrations in 2011 about rigged elections when Putin won again, Putin came out and said, this is Hillary Clinton's fault. And the demonstrators out there are funded by Americans. They take cash from Americans. They're paid. This is not real. So he has created this virtual reality, and people believe it. The state television in Russia is a big force behind Putin's propaganda, right? How many opposition channels do you know that function in Russia? How many different opinions do you hear in Russia? And when you live in this kind of circumstances where you're surrounded by the narratives, how great Russia is, how beautiful and the most powerful country it is on the planet, and there is this evil West that's trying to destroy all that because they're so jealous of us, well, you might believe it in the name of Russian nationalism. And I do understand that, especially amongst older generations who remember the great times of the Soviet Union, as opposed to younger generations who might have access to social media, right? They might already have some questions when they go out and travel. They see that Europeans don't live in the same way. But older generations are very malleable to this kind of narratives. And most of Russia is old.
So, interestingly enough, during the time of the war, there were incidents in Russia itself, discrimination against people who were of Georgian descent, an attempt to ban Georgian wines, and things of that nature. But after 2008, we stopped really hearing what was happening. There were some reports about this stealthy, incremental expansion of the occupation past the regional basically borders and lines that they have taken, but there wasn't any comprehensive follow-up to the situation in Georgia and what was happening. So what was the situation like between 2008 and 2013? What was happening once Russia already invaded Georgia?
Right. 2008 and 2013, I mean, between this time frame, 5 years, a lot has happened in Georgia. From 2008 to 2012, we still had the Saakashvili's government, United National Movement. And despite the war, I don't think we took any substantive measures against Russia because Georgian economy is tied to Russian economy. And no matter how hard you try to break that tie, Georgia is going to get harmed more than Russia because we are 3.7 million people and we're highly dependent on trade, exports, energy routes through Russia, and et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, we have kind of always been related to a Russian economy in one way or another in different stages of history, sometimes more so, sometimes less so. And even today, we trade with Russia, and that is the reality. In 2012, when the Saakashvili government was voted out, then we got the Georgian Dream, and that was a transformational time in Georgia's history because a lot of people really celebrated the end of Saakashvili's violent regime, human rights violations, having no freedom of speech, and really living in the country under repressive measures for 9 years. And in that sense, 2012 was a seminal step in Georgia's history when the Georgian Dream government steps in as a new, fresh start and a lot of hope for oppressed Georgians to regain human rights, rebuild democracy, and have freedom of expression.
So the question about Saakashvili government, did he not see that that sort of, authoritarian approach would backfire and force people to seek alternatives that were hardly better? What made him believe that this was in any way positive? What did he not have any other alternatives to, for instance, keep pro-Russian sentiments down? Why did he find it necessary to employ repressive measures?
I think he was young. A lot of his team was young. I think they really believed that they were irreplaceable. They were
Mhm.
the ultimate leaders of Georgia, and they really got enchanted by the grips of power. And they wanted to tighten those measures to stay in power as long as they can. They oppressed people. They did not shy away from doing that. But the suppression can go in either of the ways, right? In Putin's case, it was very successful. It consolidated his power. He's more powerful today than yesterday. But in Saakashvili's case, people actually stood up against him. And I think that was also Ivanishvili's power. I don't think he saw another significant force like Bidzina Ivanishvili coming in the country so soon, and people would rally behind him. So I think it was a strategic failure from his end for sure. And looking back, he probably regrets it as well.
So, looking at Ivanishvili, what exactly was his background? Why was he compelling to the general public? And was there not a concern about him bringing in local organized crime into politics and the Russian influence behind all of it?
Well, Ivanishvili is a big philanthropist, right? For many, many years, he has helped the country, has built wonderful churches and different kinds of institutions to support the development of Georgia. He's a billionaire. How did he make money? I don't know. He does own shares of Gazprom, which is a Russian gas oil company, which is why a lot of people assume that he still has ties with Russia and pretty strong ones. But he also has other means, other businesses, and he's a successful businessman. That's what it is. And since I remember, Ivanishvili has been one of the greatest Georgians. He has been a supporter of Saakashvili as well, and Saakashvili has thanked him for many, many projects. So he's a big philanthropist. So in 2012 he came on the political scene and he established this coalition that aimed at defeating Saakashvili. People liked him, people supported him because we knew nothing but good about his deeds for our country.
So at that time, he didn't appear suspicious. He just appeared as as a familiar face in
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give you an idea, Ivanishvili has always behind the scenes. We never really knew how he even looked. We just knew that there was this great billionaire who supported our country, who paid salaries, who paid stipends to students, who built churches. And we never really knew who that person was until 2012 when he decided to become public.
That's
So he
fascinating.
was like a superhero behind the scenes.
So he was more like, Batman and less like your typical oligarch or Donald Trump, a very public personality, well known well before he got into politics and like all over the place with his face.
Right. I mean, we knew him. He was well known. We just didn't know what his face looked like because he was a quiet philanthropist, right? That's what you want in a philanthropist as well. That no, he does not have interviews asking for credit. He does his own thing and people are happy about it.
So how was he able to get to where he was? Was it simply just a matter of funding his campaign that he was financially successful and he had good reputation? Or did he need to have some sort of a political operation beyond just the name recognition?
So in 2012, Ivanishvili's government was a coalition government. A lot of opposition forces came together. He stepped in as a leader. He stepped in with the funding. And it was a unity of opposition forces that merged together to defeat Saakashvili. And there was so much enthusiasm. There's people who were mad, who were oppressed, who were silenced, all of a sudden saw light at the end of the tunnel. And that was Ivanishvili's leadership, but also a lot of opposition forces who have been fighting against Saakashvili for nine years. So it was not only him, it was mostly people actually who wanted change. And his reputation, his money, people around him made it all possible.
So what was the political climate like at the time he was coming to power? And who were the members of the Georgian Dream Party, not just the general population who supported a sorted coalition, but who was his personal base? Um, and was there any suspicion of election interference at that time in that election?
It was impossible to have suspicions in the election in interference in 2012. People wanted change, and Ivanishvili's government won by landslide. So that Saakashvili couldn't even say anything. He just left the country. And it was probably the first time in our history when we managed to have a peaceful transition of power, like it should be in a proper democracy.
Sure.
There was no such thing as the Georgian Dream Party back then. It was the Georgian Dream coalition of parties.
Mm-hmm.
Georgian Dream Party emerged as a lot of people tried to distancing themselves from Ivanishvili for various reasons. There were rumors about internal disagreements. A lot of people expected to become ministers after the elections were over, and he changed his mind. It never worked. Of course, people got upset and left his team. And this was a process. Some people would get fired, some people would get hired, some people would get upset, and new people would emerge to want to have connections. And this is how the Georgian Dream Party was created. It was through the process, and almost nobody that was with Ivanishvili in 2012 is now with the Georgian Dream Party in 2024, which is very interesting. This is not the Georgian Dream Party we voted for in 2012. This is a completely different team, different people that now are supporting Ivanishvili.
What was the original platform of that coalition other than just defeating Saakashvili?
It was all about that, really. There were different political parties back then, small opposition parties that did not have funding, did not have resources. All they had was their own words, their own desire to fight against the regime. And Ivanishvili just united these people. Now we should also remember that a lot of artists who have been supported by Ivanishvili for decades, who have been receiving stipends from him, could not um, deny the fact that they wanted this man, a huge philanthropist, at the grips of the power of the Georgian politics. So people liked him. The whole opposition spectrum was with him.
Mm-hmm.
And this was all his platform. This is all he needed. People wanted to break away from the Saakashvili government, and he was sort of this person who could do it.
At the time, of course, by then it was the Obama administration who also claimed to be all about democracy and grassroots movements. What was their reaction to the Ivanishvili election?
I think Ivanishvili elections got very positive feedback all over the world. People have spoken. This was the first time when we had peaceful transition of power, which is a clear sign of democratic consolidation in the Caucasus. Georgia has been considered as a beacon of democracy for a long time. And it was a big success. Also, having Saakashvili not make a huge fuss about it and admit the defeat and move on was a big step for our democracy and society. And of course, people like it in the country and outside of it.
So Ivanishvili comes to power. Meanwhile, we are seeing Euromaidan in Ukraine. Yanukovych, huge, basically Russian puppet, gets forced out of power. What was the resonance of that in Georgia at the time?
2014, unlike Ukraine, for Georgia was a very good year. I don't think there was any spillover effect of the Maidan revolution. In Georgia, we obviously were sorry what happened in the Maidan and then the annexation of Crimea that followed that and conflicts in eastern Ukraine. But it was not palpable in Georgia back then because in 2014, we actually had significant advancements with our Western integration. For example, with NATO, we developed the substantial NATO Georgia package, SNGP, which is, I don't want to say almost like a map membership action plan, but it is a plan according to which you advance your security institutions every year. There was annual national plan to meet these demands. And also we got the association agreement with the European Union that brought visa-free movement between Schengen countries and Georgia, which was a big, big step. And meanwhile, Ukraine was struggling with the Yanukovych pro-Russian regime. People were dying as a result of the revolution and the subsequent war in Crimea. So this was a very different time for Georgia. It was, I think, still a honeymoon for the Georgian dreams election, frankly, because we were moving forward, we were improving. Along with the advancements with Western integration, people felt like freedom of speech was finally a thing in Georgia. We had human rights and we had control over our society. So it was a good time.
So when did things started to change from this, positive dynamic to the replacement of key figures to questions about how the power was being really retained and just this move away from this democratic and positive institution?
I think after two terms, after 8 years, so in around 2020, I personally started noticing things that I did not like anymore. There were a lot of signs that were kind of red flags for me as a democratic citizen. I am a very demanding citizen. I want my government to always offer me more. But in 2022, when the war started in Ukraine, the Georgian government adopted clearly anti-Western stance. They started decrying Western politicians, openly being against certain European countries, ambassadors serving in our country. And that was a big no-no for me in 2022. Now, I need to also clarify what the government's official stance is about this. They are claiming that after the war in Ukraine in 2022, the Western partners tried to drag Georgia into another war with Russia to open the second front to support Ukraine, and they refused to do it in the interest of Georgian people, which is logical. I mean, we are a small country, we're 3.7 million, we have not enough military strength and power to fight against Russia. But was this true? Was anyone trying to drag us into another war? I don't know. There's no evidence of it. It depends on what you believe in and what you don't believe in. And they are justifying this immense pressure on the Georgian government to open the second front in Georgia as a means to stand up against the Western leaders and Western society. This is their official narrative.
At what point has that become? Is there anyone the narrative? Who was really responsible? Who in the government was really responsible for it? If it wasn't Ivanishvili himself, since he apparently did not hold those views in the beginning, at least, or didn't articulate them, then who was it, and how did they get there, and why were they not replaced when it became obvious that what they were propagating was exactly the opposite of what was, the general sentiment of what or how the party originally got elected, or the not the party but the original
So I
government.
think I need to clarify that even though Ivanishvili holds no official position in the government and he's no longer the prime minister, he was the prime minister only briefly in 2012, he is very much in charge of the party. He takes every serious decision, and there's no denying of it, because every time we hear our ministers come out to give a press conference, they are thanking Bidzina Ivanishvili for his leadership. He introduces any major changes in the team. He ran with the party in 2024 for the elections, and he was giving speeches and so on and so forth. So he's very much in charge. He knows what's going on. He is the decision maker in the Georgian dream and therefore in the Georgian government. So a lot of people call him de facto unofficial leader, and he is. I don't think anybody denies that, not even his team members. Well, initially they did. They said that he stepped back and they gave them more freedom, which might have been true. But since 2020, I think he is back and in charge in the party. Why nobody said anything? I think the opposition spectrum really did. It's just another issue is that the opposition in the country is not strong. The Saakashvili government and people affiliated with him are still very much disliked, to say the least. I could even use strong words. People don't want them anywhere near power. No. And Ivanishvili's government has been standing on this narrative for over 12 years. They are against the Saakashvili regime, and people who remember the atrocities of the Saakashvili regime will still vote for him because they don't want him back. And unfortunately, the opposition spectrum in 12 years has been unable to evolve from this affiliation of Saakashvili. He's very much a very influential figure. And even if he's not, the Georgian Dream propaganda is working tirelessly to make it look like so, because it is in their own interest to keep Saakashvili in the opposition spectrum so that they can build their propaganda on it, make their party against him, to have the support of the people who don't like him. And these people are in majority in Georgia. So a healthy opposition is what we need right now. We see that a whole new generation has been already grown in Georgia. I was in primary school when Saakashvili was elected, and I was still in school when Georgian Dream was elected. But now I'm a voter. Now I'm an analyst. And a lot of people of my generation agree with me. We need difference. We need changes in our political system. And this is happening right now with the protests that we're seeing in the streets. But we need more time to gather political power as a generation to increase our voices. Before that happens, it's still the old political parties, old politicians who have lost respect among people fighting against each other. And that is not a pretty picture.
Mm-hmm. So would it be accurate to say that Ivanishvili perhaps had a plan to slowly, over time, kind of use this these internal vulnerabilities to change the system, that he didn't necessarily want to change it overnight, and he learned from Saakashvili's mistake about how not to lose popularity. But it was these changes that led to where his group is currently were intentional and not just incidental to who ended up being with him.
I think Ivanishvili has been absolutely utilizing internal vulnerabilities and even learning from the Saakashvili regime. For example, our legal system is very interesting. We had prosecutors, judges who ruled on cases that were highly scandalous and controversial during the Saakashvili time. We're talking about people murdered in the streets without any justification.
Mm-hmm.
Severe human rights violations. We're talking about mothers protesting in front of the parliament because their children died. We don't know how. All we know is that our former regime killed them. And the Ivanishvili regime kept those controversial public servants in our judicial system.
Why?
So I think the only logical explanation, at least to me, is to have people who do dirty work for you on your side.
Mm-hmm.
If you know people who did dirty work for somebody else and you promised them freedom in exchange of continuing what they did for others for you, which option do you think those corrupt judges were going to take?
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Right? They have no dignity left, anyways. And that has been a big red flag for me since 2012. Why did we not free our judicial system? This was a big problem. Judicial system was weaponized by the state over and over again, and we see that continue because people who did that during Saakashvili are the same people who do this under Ivanishvili. And if you don't change people, how can I expect to change the system?
Personnel is policy, as they say. That is a very good point. I'm surprised that there was no pushback and outrage over the fact that these people were not fired after or replaced after this new party that promised change came to power. After all, the whole point was the change, and institutional change is at the crux of it all.
Absolutely. I think this is where people could have done more.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, there were a lot of people protesting against this move, but for the audience to understand, when you're oppressed for 9 years and all of a sudden you see light at the end of the tunnel, you're not focusing on trees, you're focusing on the wood. You're focusing on the good, what has been changed, the improvements that you have felt all of a sudden, because now you're free, you can breathe. And a lot of changes or similarities that stayed from the carryovers from the Saakashvili government were not paid attention to. And this is a mistake of the democratic society back then. People should have been more demanding in this regard, and now it's too late.
So there's been a lot of questions about why Saakashvili, after everything that happened, returned to Georgia, and I've heard stories about a Russian mistress in Ukraine or pro-Russian mistress who manipulated him into doing so, playing on his vanity and narcissism. I don't know how much of that is true, whether it's just a contributing factor or what the story is, but ultimately he ended up in Georgia immediately, got arrested, thrown in prison, and is basically undergoing the same treatment that his opponents accused him of. So how did this all happen? Why isn't there a bigger noise about it from his supporters? And how has it not become kind of a flashpoint of the opposition, our rallying point? Because normally, if your leader ends up being tortured in prison, usually there's a huge outcry and it becomes an international, calamity but I have not really seen that compared to other places in the world.
Well, they tried. They certainly tried. They poured in a lot of money in lobbyists in Washington, D.C. There were some shows on CNN. But the truth is, Georgian people don't care about Saakashvili anymore. Like I said, this is a different country, different people. Generations have been grown up, and he is very much in the past. Why did he return to the country? I have no idea because he knew that he he was going to be arrested. There was litigation against him. This was no secret, and he sneaked into the country, I think, with a truck of herbs of something like that. I am not sure, and I don't want to spread fake news, but he did not come to the country with legal means. So that's already trespassing. That's already a criminal offense, and your place is in the jail. I don't care if you're a former president or who. You broke the law. You need to be punished. That's one thing. And another thing also is there was international noise around Saakashvili from his former colleagues, former supporters, but it's not enough. At the end of the day, the diplomacy is about the people, about the country, and nobody's going to damage 30-year-old democratic relations because of one person. Yes, there were letters to the government, oh, release him, he doesn't need to be in jail, but nothing more. Nobody was going to push more because at the end of the day, it's one person, even though it's Saakashvili. Another important thing related to him is that I'm not sure if he's tortured in the prison, actually. He refused to take food himself. He brought these illnesses upon himself because he was starving himself to death. And then he was hospitalized because the state wanted to help him. There were a lot of scandals around the state and the government trying to kill him, poison him. But there's no evidence that that happened. I understand that people close to him had these concerns, but I am an analyst. I am trained to evaluate the evidence, and I've got nothing to say other than he's still in the hospital, he's improving, he's doing better. I do have problems with the way the whole judicial process and everything has been handled related to him, but I don't think that international pressure should have been anything more significant than it actually was to release him. At the end of the day, people need to decide on him. The Georgians need to decide on him. And we'll see what happens because the trial's still going on.
Let me put it this way, keeping him in the jail or keeping him in the news in any way contributes to the hardening of the opposition around his figure as opposed to transition to another form of opposition. So any sort of martyr-like situation creates this, this continuing rallying around that person instead of focusing on the issues. So that alone should have been a reason for the government to release him, just to put an end to that and not use it as an argument.
The thing is, if he's released, it will be very polarizing for the Georgian society because majority of Georgians don't want him in the country. People just don't like him anymore.
Well, he could be expelled, released and expelled somewhere.
Could be. There might have been some negotiations about it. I don't know. Personally, I felt that his demands at the hospital, asking to be transferred to a different hospital in a different country for better treatment because the Georgian hospital where he is right now was not sufficient enough to treat him, was actually about asking foreign countries for an asylum to stay there. But this is my theory, and again, I don't have evidence for it. So
but what I don't understand about this whole situation, hasn't he also been granted Ukrainian citizenship, and wasn't he at one point a mayor in Ukraine? Why wasn't he just released back to Ukraine and that's it, and the end of the story?
Well, I am not sure, honestly. He was in Ukraine. He was working for the Ukrainian government in different positions since he lost the election. He was brought into the country to help Ukraine
Mhm.
fight corruption. I don't know why he went back to Georgia. I don't. Theory from his former colleagues is that a lot of people were calling him back into the country with false expectations that people would support him and there would be another revolution to bring him back into the power, that people still loved him, people still adored him and saw him as a sole leader. But that's not true.
Mhm.
The entire generation has been grown up in Georgia in the past 12 years. And what you see right now in social media, whenever he makes a post, whenever he is asking his supporters to do something via Facebook posts, you will see a lot of young leaders comment, "Shut up, keep it together. We do not want to hear from you anymore. Your time is up. Respect the Georgian people's decision that you're no longer in power, and we don't want you back." And that is very clearly articulated message, which I am not sure if it has been received for over years, but I know that people have that.
In the meantime, regarding the Russian presence in the country since 2014, since the Crimean invasion, from what I've heard, it has become more brazen over time. And my question is, what was the reaction of the various governments, the Ivanishvili administration, everyone who followed him, to that presence? What was that dynamic going on until up to 2022, when they basically did what, took the position that you described?
With Ukraine?
No, no, inside Georgia, the Russian occupants
Oh, what was the attitude of
of the
the Georgian
government.
government to Russian
Yeah.
occupants since 2008 to 2022? Is that the question?
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting question for sure, because when Saakashvili's government was very vocal and vocally anti-Russian, this government is not so vocal about
Hmm.
the Russian atrocities that has been happening in our country. They are not open to decry Russian actions, creeping occupation. As you might know, even though we have no armed conflict anymore, Russian so-called peacekeepers try to move the fences and border lines inch
Hmm.
by inch closer to the capital in Georgia, which is absolutely atrocious. It is what we call creeping occupation, and a lot of international community has been speaking against it. But we don't hear the Georgian government vocally decrying Russian occupation and taking anti-Russian stance. Initially, this was part of the so-called non-upsetting politics. So don't provoke Russia and you won't receive backlash. That was the
Hmm.
rationale behind this. And a lot of people understood this. But later, then we see a lot of accusations with Ivanishvili's alignment with Russia. So, but these are all speculations. I don't, I don't have evidence to support any of this.
Has there been any popular reaction, any acts of sabotage against the Russian quote-unquote peacekeepers, or anything of that sort?
Absolutely, they are kidnapping people so frequently. They are violating international agreements. Like I mentioned, the fences to be moved all the time. And there are some Georgians living behind this administrative border lines, occupation lines. So there have been many, many violations from the so-called Russian peacekeepers. They have not been keeping peace for Georgians for sure.
So is there any local effort to kind of undercut their presence, to do something against them? Have there been any popular initiatives or individual acts of basically resistance?
I don't think there's a massive resistance. Obviously, there is a civil society together and some non-governmental organizations working on deoccupation and similar issues. I know there is the EUMM, European Union Monitoring Mission, which is the only international mission observing what's going on in Georgia's occupied territories and administrative borderlines. But no, I don't see any significant efforts taken from the government side, which I think goes back to what I mentioned about this non-upsetting politics towards Russia that Georgian government has been taken since 2012. I think that's part of it. But obviously, when people get stolen and people get kidnapped, I'm sorry, and they are in occupied zones and kept as a hostage kept as a hostage by the separatists, the Georgian government steps in, and there are negotiations to transfer Georgian citizens into the Georgian-controlled land. But I don't see any further concerted efforts towards deoccupation.
So there's been, of course, a lot of talk about the internal political upheaval, but not so much about the geopolitical importance and role of Georgia to the various international players, be they Russia, the EU, US, or for that matter, the Middle East. One of the interesting things that I'm noticing is that Iran is backing the Georgian dream along with Russia. And on the other hand, there's concern that the pipelines that deliver Azerbaijani oil to Israel through Georgia could be disrupted in the event Russia takes a greater hold inside the country. So let's talk about this kind of geopolitical aspect of the situation.
Right. I think since the war in Ukraine, there has been a significant geopolitical shift in Georgia's political climate, at least, and in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. While we are giving a lot of credit to Russia, China has becoming an increasingly powerful player in the region, and Georgian government has been adopting this Eurasianist stance. So we don't choose Europe or Russia or anyone. We are a Eurasian country, and we are going to partner with everyone because that benefits our economic well-being. That includes Iranian leaders, that includes the Chinese leaders and Central Asians, as well as Europeans. But from the geopolitical spectrum, if you look at it, Europe and the United States have increasingly become bad, malicious actors in the Georgian politics because they meddle into our domestic politics, while these other powers don't dare to do that. We just have economic ties with them. We know what our benefits are, and they don't interfere in our domestic politics. That is their narrative. Now, in terms of Iran, Azerbaijan, Armenia, these countries are in our neighborhood. And historically, we have had great relations with all of them. Persians have been our invaders at one time, but after that, we have had great partnerships with Iran and Armenia, Azerbaijan, despite their Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, right? We've always stayed out of it. Mm-hmm. And China is finding a new way into the region. You might have heard about the so-called Middle Corridor, which is a crucial transportation route that connects European Union with China through the Caucasus, bypassing Iran and Russia. This is a very interesting development because Russia is sanctioned, Iran is sanctioned, and the route passing through the Caucasus that also go through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and reaches the European Union allows Westerners and the Chinese to avoid the sanctioned countries and keep them under economic sanctions. This should be in everybody's interest. This is a big economic development for Georgia as well, because we are going to get a lot of money out of this trade and transportation companies that arrange cargo transports through our land. We are now building the first deep sea port that is going to allow us to transfer significant amount of cargo through maritime means. This is called the Anaklia port that was initially going to be built by a Georgian American consortium, but some scandals took place, and now we have the Chinese Singaporean consortium owning 49% of this port, along with 51% of the Georgian government ownership. That will soon be operating, I believe, in 2-3 years. That is when the first stage is going to open, and this will be a significant development for our country to designate Georgia as a significant transportation route member. As for the pipelines, yes, we are also part of several pipelines. Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan is one of them to transport LNG. And yeah, I mean, economically, Georgia has been becoming this Eurasian country, and we will see where this goes.
Very interesting. So this economic connectivity kind of, almost plays against this polarized East-West narrative.
Right. Because economic ties are different from political ties, right? In a way, I mean, Americans and the Chinese are a great example. They are interdependent economically. One is a democratic country, the other is a communist country. But because they have political differences, it doesn't mean that they cannot do business together. And a lot of criticism towards the West from the Georgian government has been, especially in this realm. And not only the Georgian government, frankly, I've traveled with US members of Congress to Africa, where African leaders continuously say, don't make us choose. We want to partner with the United States. We want to partner with Europe, Russia, China, everyone, because we are not in the position to choose. We need to feed our society. We need to generate wealth, develop economically. And when you have economically developed communities within your own country, you prosper as a democracy, as a society, as an economy. Economic success is a major part of democratic success as well. And under the Georgian Dream government, we have indeed seen tremendous economic growth.
So what is the Georgian Dream economic vision and plan, and can they keep it separate from the political choices that they are making?
The Georgian Dream has ambitious economic plans, for sure. They want to transform our economy to the point that in 4 or 5 years, we are on the level of EU member countries. We're not talking about Western or Central European democracies. Our models are toward our Eastern European democracies, and we want to be on their level economically, which is an ambitious plan because we were very behind years ago. But right now, we are one of the fastest developing economies in the region because of this geopolitical changes that I've been mentioning. I mean, sanctioning Russia and Iran have actually worked for the benefit of Georgia, which I thought initially would be another great opportunity for us to align with the West, become closer with the West. But what the Georgian government is doing right now with anti-Western narratives, I think they are missing this historic opportunity and damaging the bridge that we've been building for 30 years.
That's crazy. So that makes it kind of a hard choice for people. Do they want more democracy and freedom, or do they want more economic prosperity, with which you can't really have full freedom if you don't have economic prosperity? And what does the opposition have to offer beside, in response?
These are all great questions. Georgian people are freedom-loving people by nature. And this is best demonstrated by history because every single large empire has set its footprint in the Caucasus and Georgia. We're still standing as a separate nation, very small one, but a very mighty one. And none of the imperial powers have been able to destroy us as a country, as a nation. And this is what is keeping us going. This character of Georgians, the love for freedom, democracy, you also see translate into street protests. We do not shy away from going out and being loud and vocal about what we want. So I think in that sense, Yes, Georgian people do want freedom. They do want democracy, but do many of them know what freedom of democracy and democracy mean in the 21st century? I think we still have a lot of work to do with this respect. A lot of people forget that majority of Georgian population has been born and raised in the Soviet Union. And Soviet Union was not a democratic country, and people who were brought up in that time have different set of values than my generation and future generations who were brought up with smartphones, with the internet, and open borders. And even if we had closed borders, we have a social media that erases all the borders. So what democracy means to these people might be different from what democracy means to
Mhm.
me and people of my age. But in the end, we know that we do not want to have a patron and we do not want to depend on someone. We want to develop independently, individually, and become a member of this developed Western community. That is the end goal. What the opposition is offering on this track, I don't know. I think I have a lot of criticism towards the opposition forces. They are significantly relying on their pro-Western stance. Oh, we are pro-Western. We want European integration. We're going to build great ties with Americans. But how are you going to do that?
Mm.
Right? I'm a Georgian citizen watching TV, and for 12 years, this is the only narrative I hear, that the Georgian dream is pro-Russian and they're pro-European. So what? Tell me more about it. Why are you pro-European? What are you promising me? What steps are you going to take? But unfortunately, the Georgian political spectrum is very different from what you might expect in a society where there is a need for communication between various groups of community. We are a very diverse population, right? Ethnically, racially, religiously. But the opposition TV channels, they are just sitting on their chairs comfortably. And for 12 years, they have been running their own propaganda, while the Georgian Dream has been running their own propaganda, which is why it is hard for them to win a lot of people. If there are no specific steps, and if we don't talk about politics, if we don't debate, we're not going to have people thinking about specific policies, right? Then they make emotional decisions,
Mhm.
personality based decisions. Who do I like more? Who do I dislike more? And this is a threat to our democracy for sure. And I hope that the opposition learns from its mistakes and opens up the space for free discussion, for people to hear a lot of different opinions and decide who's right and who's not.
So some of the Western observers in particular are describing the current predicament as as a clash of intergenerational values over social conservative versus European style openness. Is that really the case, or is there more to the story? And if that is the case, why isn't the younger generation winning decisively, given that they consider all these both sides of this argument basically outdated and parochial?
I think intergenerational struggle is not unique to Georgia. This is what we see in the United States, what we see in Europe. Young people just think differently. And
Sure.
especially my generation, Gen Z, millennials, and future generations, we were really born and raised in different times. This is the post Cold War circumstances where the United States was this superpower, the defeat of Russia after the Cold War, and the internet revolution. I think people underestimate the power of the internet revolution. We think differently. And this translates into generational gap for sure. I see this in propaganda as well. My generation is very well trained in identifying what's fake, what's real. There are a lot of misinformation, fake news kind of videos and posts I see on social media that a lot of people over 45, 50 share with me and express their concerns over what's going on. And I see that in this video, You cannot identify anything. This video could be anything. I could give it a different title and you would still buy it. Digital literacy is a problem. And this certainly is a generational thing, not only in the in Georgia, but also in the United States and in the rest of the world. Why the younger generations are not winning? It's a simple math. We are a minority. Most people are over 45 in major parts of the world. I mean, the population has been shrinking everywhere. This is why I'm saying that our younger generations need more time to develop political strength, to make political changes, not only in Georgia, but also all over the world. And I do agree that there is a generational gap in Georgia that also translates into votes. We just see the world in different ways. And I do write sometimes editorials about these issues, and I do have an editorial in the Caucasus Watch, which is one of the premier news outlets covering the region, where I talk about this generational gap translated into the 2024 parliamentary elections. So if people are interested, I would highly encourage to go to that webpage and look up that article titled Inside Georgia's 2024 Elections.
So that brings me to a question of, once again, if the European Union, the United States, are so concerned about the outcome of what's going on, they're concerned about democracy, they're concerned about limiting Russian at all influence, why aren't they investing more economically in Georgia and giving more financial incentives to move more towards the West and not just be Eurasian and so forth?
I think it has many different reasons. To start with, Georgia is a very small country, and it is definitely not on the priority list of any major powers. This is how I look at it. I have worked in Washington, D.C. for over 2 years, and frankly, I barely met a person who thinks about Georgia during the working hours. Georgia is something that you think about after your working hours, if you feel like, if you have time. And also, economic investments are tied to political stability, right? Not many people want to invest in a Russian-occupied country with a lot of turbulent turmoils, mass demonstrations once in a while, this increased pressure from the West, anti-democratic drift in the last couple of years. But even though this is happening, Georgia still has a lot more investments than it did years ago, which is why we have been very successful economically lately. Also, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is a thing. The Chinese come in with initiatives and investments. And the Western limited ability to invest in those developing nations has been shown primarily in Africa, than in Eastern Europe and other places where they don't recognize the opportunities there. And then you have the Chinese recognize that opportunity coming in, and all of a sudden then the West is worried why China is eating their own lunch. So it is a criticism and a shortfall in the Western economic policy strategy, probably. But I'm not an economist, right? I just look at this from the geopolitical angle.
Sure. And that's fair enough. And that leads me to another question. We are seeing, there's been so much talk about the foreign agent law and the impact it would have, and we've seen mass demonstrations. And now, no, there's the election, the attention, the focus shifted to the elections. No one is really talking about the civil society, the impact of this foreign agent law, what's actually happening as a result. So what has been the situation since it was passed?
Well, I have been trying to investigate that as well. I do want to prepare a video about that when I have more evidence, but people don't talk about it because it has not been come into force yet. The Georgian government has not been enforcing that law yet. I know that majority of non-governmental organizations did not register as foreign agent. And those who did, there was a short documentary that was saying that this law is for nothing. It just buries us under it buries us into paperwork, and we have no financial means to hire extra accountants who can upload all this documentation on the webpage. My understanding is that this foreign agent law is not trying to uncover malicious intentions of foreign powers, but this is just another bureaucratic layer that nobody really wanted. This is the nitty gritty of every single bill, what you're paying, what you're buying. So very, very tiny things that are now detailed into this database. And we will see what happens when the Georgian Dream decides to enact this law. And when is it going to be? My feeling is that that's going to be somewhere 2-3 months before the local elections in 2025, because that will create another turmoil, another challenge for the opposition, and distract the opposition forces to prepare for the elections. That is my guess.
So you think that the purpose of the law was not the actual, attack on civil society per se, but or on foreign influence or the United States, but really it was all about just causing a mass distraction and just forcing people to come out against something that was inevitable, and meanwhile, being able to focus on their own political advancement.
I agree with that. I do. I think that this law was just another means to keep the Georgian dream in power and also aggravate their own propaganda, right? Their propaganda is that the Western forces are meddling into our domestic politics. We don't want that. We need to take actions against that. And here is the foreign agent law that is going to do that. Is it going to do that? I am not sure, because when you want to counter malicious foreign actors in your country, you take different ways. And I do appreciate if you adopt a legislation that's trying to tackle that and give you a better opinion about where the foreign money is going into your country. The United States has that law, the European Union countries have that law. But in Georgia's case, it's really different. When I saw different non-governmental organizations that are registered in this foreign agent law database, they say that they are not asked to report the nature of the projects they are doing. So, and my legitimate question is, how are you going to tell if the intent of that NGO is good or bad if you don't ask them to give you information about the nature of their work?
Sure.
They just want to see bills. They just want to see what they're buying. And I don't believe that the database is going to deter malicious intentions in my country. I think there should be more concerted efforts. And this is something that was clearly used to cause a turmoil in the country. And the demonstration of this is that the foreign agent law before the spring 2024 was also introduced in 2023. And when the government saw a significant backlash from the people, they tabled it. And they said, never again. This law is done. We understand that people don't like it. We are not going to discuss it again. And in less than a year, we see their determination to adopt the law again, ignoring the turmoil caused in the country again. Why? Because this was 4 or 5 months before the parliamentary elections. And after that, I've heard many government officials saying that they tested the opposition's real power, real resources. They made them tired before the elections. They kind of drained them from their administrative and financial resources to mobilize their voters for the election. So it is very obvious for me that this is part of their political electoral game to consolidate their power.
So this is fascinating, especially now that the election is over. There's a talk about this hardline pro-Russian president in place. There's a talk about election meddling. Are there really any grounds for challenging the elections? Do the activists have the means to topple the government?
Well, first of all, I don't think the president matters enough to be either pro-Russian or pro-Western. I think he's a very nominal figure. He doesn't even have an undergraduate degree. He's a former soccer player who has a bad mouth in Georgian parliament and has been increasingly anti-EU and anti-United States. So frankly, I don't think he's there to have a political agenda and knows what he's doing. He's just somebody who will do what he is told to do. This is how I view this. As for the rigged elections, this is not up to me to say. I mean, I'm a one person and I cannot really speak on behalf of the whole nation. This is a very controversial issue. All I can say is that the Georgian president has appealed to Strasbourg, the court in Strasbourg, and I'm waiting for the results. I'm not sure if they can prove it, whether the elections were rigged to the extent that that would change the percentage of votes and that would change the way our government might have looked like today. I am going to trust with this process to the professionals.
Sure, fair enough. And the question is now, we have seen a slew of government resignations days before the presidential election. Does that mean that is there then really a political mandate? Why did all these people resign? Is there some sort of a internal struggle that is undermining the governing party?
A wave of government resignations, I think, is a sign that Georgian people want change. There's something wrong within the system, and increasingly many people are speaking against it. I don't think there have been enough resignations to dismantle the whole government or demolish the Georgian dream and their power, but it's a start. When increasingly many people are speaking against you and increasingly many people show that there is something wrong within the system you built, I think this process becomes irreversible, and we're only going to see the protests against the Georgian dream continue and take different forms and shapes, whether it's resignation, whether it's street protests, or less votes in elections.
What is the likely impact of postponing the accession talks with the EU? And is there really a chance that the political situation can be turned around in 4 years, or is it basically the Georgian dream basically killing any formal rapprochement with the West?
Right. Well, I want to start with the government's official statement, what they would answer if you had asked that question to them. I think any government official would have told you that they are not stopping the EU negotiations or accessions. They are just not trying to negotiate this accession process with them for 4 years because they want to end the speculation from the EU side, because they are interfering in our domestic politics and they are using this EU Georgia integration as a tool to kind of control the developments in Georgia. So they would tell you that they are not postponing the EU accession or anything related to. They would just tell you that our perceptions are wrong. But the European Union is a demand-driven organization. The EU does not come to you with desires to expand. You go to the European Union with the desire to join. And if you stop asking them that we want to join, and if you stop doing zealous diplomacy that our diplomats have been doing for 30 years, why are you doing that? You know, you need to be knocking on the door with hopes that one day somebody will open the door for you. Why are you stopping knocking? Nobody's going to hear you if you don't knock. I also understand that there is a European Union integration fatigue among the Georgians because this promise has been there for a long, long time. And it's hard to believe in something or continue believing in something that has not turned into reality for so long. And there are limited signs that you will ever join this union. So a lot of people are skeptic. And the Georgian Dream is saying, oh, send us the documents. We're going to sign these documents. But we know that the European Union is not going to do it. And people who support the Georgian Dream like that stance. They think that they are adopting this firm, hardline approach, defending our national interests, and not allowing Georgians to beg the Europeans to accept into the organizations where they have no intention of accepting. So this is how it looks. This looks very patriotic from Georgian Dream supporters, very pro-Georgian. But from a diplomatic and foreign policy perspective, it's just wrong. It's just wrong. If you have a problem with the European Union, if you don't want the European partners to meddle into your domestic politics, you take that to the negotiation table. You take that behind the curtains and don't put that on the record. You do diplomacy, and you have that hardline approach behind the doors if you don't want to damage the image of the European Union, if you don't want to damage the image of Georgian people and your government. This is how I would behave. Negotiate on problems as a professional. Don't make a propaganda out of it. This is where I don't understand this stance.
Fair enough. It's a concern to people because they basically see it as a worrisome sign that Georgia's turning its back on the West. Um, do you think that this whole thing about EU backing the LGBTQ issues was the most important tool in the election meddling or the Georgian Dream or the Georgian Dream basically propaganda and platform? And if so, is there a way to stand up for pro-Western values without polarizing the socially conservative members of the population in the future?
Well, the LGBTQ rights is also something that Vladimir Putin inserted into his propaganda in 2010s, and then it reverberated into the Georgian Dreams propaganda in 2020s, just now. This is a highly polarizing issue for the Georgian society. And I understand that there are fundings to pro-LGBTQ non-governmental organizations that want to integrate this community within the larger part of our society. And I also believe that the Georgian Dream made a whole propaganda out of it. We adopted this anti-LGBTQ propaganda law, which prohibits the use of any images and movies televised that feature single-sex kissing scenes or anything similar. So we are defending our children from this propaganda. And that law was something that resonated to a lot of Georgians with traditional values, to see LGBTQ society as totally unacceptable, deplorable, and bad for our future development. So is the European Union forcing us to adopt LGBTQ pro rights, adopt single-sex marriage? I highly, highly doubt that. There's no evidence of it. And as an example, in the European Union, there are countries like Bulgaria who does not have a single-sex marriage. So why is the European Union forcing Georgia, that is not a member of the European Union, to adopt this single-sex marriage? Why is it not forcing already a member to do this? This is the same religiously same community, right? Bulgarians are also Eastern Orthodox, Georgians are also Eastern Orthodox. But a lot of times people don't have this understanding. People don't ask this kind of questions. Sometimes they don't know, or they cannot relate this. All they know is that this is a highly polarizing, emotional issue that the government is using. I was shocked when the government brought up this anti-LGBTQ rhetoric in 2024 for the election campaign, because there was no need for it. Easy as that. I mean, Georgia has 0 single-sex marriage, and we adopted the law to tackle single-sex marriage. So what are we
It's a
solving right
solution
here?
for a question that nobody's asking.
We're preventing. That's the argument, right? We're preventing, but there are many other preventive measures that cannot turn into propaganda.
Hmm. That's yeah, basically. Finally, here's my question. Do you think that the political impact of Russia's geopolitical strategy is succeeding? Can the outcome of or at least the current trend in Georgia impact other elections or movements in Europe and other places?
I think the only way Russia can succeed is through Russian disinformation and propaganda campaigns. This is what they are good at, and this
Mhm.
is where they win the hearts and minds of outside or inside citizens without them even knowing that they are victims of propaganda. We see Russian propaganda succeed in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Armenia, and a lot of Eastern and Western Europe. So it is working. Whether we like it to admit it or not, it is working, which is why we need to continue fighting against Russian propaganda and see what becomes of it. Is Russia succeeding geopolitically? I don't know. Um, there are a lot of signs showing that it's not. No matter how the war in Ukraine is going to turn out, it is a matter of the fact that NATO has expanded as a result of the war. So Russia did not want NATO to expand. The opposite has happened. If Russia did not want the EU to expand, the opposite is happening because Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are on the accelerated path of European Union membership. A lot of things have backfired on Russia, but it might as well be temporary. Should not forget that Russia has tremendous resources and power to restore, regain its strength, and come back as a stronger player than it is or it has been, which is why we should be careful and we need to plan very efficiently in the West, especially because this is the part of the world that Russia considers to be its rival and enemy, if you will.
Well, thank you so much for this excellent overview, and I learned a lot from this discussion, and I hope many of our viewers will as well, because I am seeing a lot of imagery on social media, on LinkedIn, a lot of discussions, they're emotionally charged, understandably so, but I don't think without understanding these nuances, the background for where it all originated and how it got to this point, that people can really make a good policy recommendations or understand why things are going the way they are. And I think it was what you explained here shed a great deal of light and made it clear that the situation is far more complex. It cannot be easily put into boxes, black and white. These guys are bad and these guys are wonderful.
Right, right. There's more to it. The Western social media is permeated by this Russia West kind of narrative, and people are split up against it. But there's more to it. I always discourage people from taking any extreme stances, and I really appreciate you allocating some time to this and allowing me to speak on different aspects of Georgian politics, which is much more complicated than what you might see in social media. And thank you for your time and willingness to allow me to speak to your audience.
Thank you so much. And for my own part, just a sign. I think one aspect of propaganda that we see is it seeks to simplify complex issues to the point where it just becomes exactly that emotional manipulation categorizing into black and white. Whereas fighting propaganda inevitably involves forcing people to see the nuance, to understand the complexity. And I think this I think is the best way to go.
I agree with that. I agree with that. People like to start to make sense of complex events. They are looking for easy solutions. And unfortunately, life is complicated and there's no such thing as easy solution. So
Thank you
I
so
hope many will learn new things from this video. Thanks again,
Absolutely.
Irina.
Thank you. And please check out Ketevan's other work, the videos, the articles that she mentioned, and hopefully, I think this very fascinating country, very fascinating political issues will continue to hold your attention beyond just sound bites here and there. And for those of us following us, we'll be back again next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you. Good night.